introduction. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming for another Science on Tap Minocqua. I have 14 pairs of glasses at home. I did not bring one of them except for these little microscopic ones. So we'll see if I can see. We have a great program tonight. Thank you for coming. Remember to put the microphone up to my mouth, like I tell everybody else. So my name is Susan Knight. I work at the University of Wisconsin Trout Lake Station. And our co-sponsors for Science on Tap here are the Minocqua Public Library, Kemp Natural Resources Station, Trout Lake Station, the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and of course our hosts here, the Minocqua Brewing Company. So thank you to everyone. Now, the purpose and the idea of Science on Tap is to share current science that's going on either here in the Northwoods in Wisconsin, and the last two speakers we've had, really science going on in the world. And this is really an open discussion. It's not a lecture. And so, as usual, the speakers will give some introductory remarks. But the program is really yours to ask questions and find out anything that you've got on your mind. Remember that when you leave, to please fill out a card if you haven't done so before. Leave your email address and we will give you a reminder of when the next Science on Tap is coming up, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. Also, if you have any ideas for speakers, that would be very helpful for us to find out what everybody would like to hear about. Also, we are streaming this live tonight, so of course that doesn't matter to you folks that are here too much, but if there's another time when you can't come, just know that we do stream this live and that you can watch it from home. We're also streaming it at the Minocqua Public Library, so especially anybody with kids or anything like that, if you want to go to a more alcohol-free environment, or if you have kids that are under 21, it's a great place to do it. Mary Taylor hosts over there, and she provides snacks. So you can go and have some snacks with Mary. Our next event, before we start talking about tonight, our next event will be December 4th. And we have something different planned for our December Science on Tap. The speaker will be Dr. Kate Vandenbosch. Kate is the Dean of UW-Madison's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. She's a new dean. And her topic will be the Wisconsin idea at work in the Northwoods. Kate will describe how the resources of the university are being used to solve some of our most pressing challenges regarding the environment, the economy, and human health. But the focus of the evening will be on the future. Specifically, how do we redefine UW-Madison for the future? She really wants to hear from you. This is your chance to share your ideas about what research the university ought to be doing and what research the university ought to be doing up here in the Northwoods. It should be an interesting evening, and we hope you will be part of that conversation next month. So that's our next Science on Tap, the Wisconsin idea in the Northwoods, December 4th. Here at the Minocqua Brewing Company. Okay, so tonight we have Professors Don Waller and Tim Van Deelen on the science behind deer management. First, I'm going to introduce Don Waller, and then Tim Van Deelen, and Tim will lead off with some comments. Don Waller is a professor in the botany department at UW-Madison, where he teaches ecology, evolution, and conservation biology. He chairs the Department of Botany and UW's undergraduate program in conservation biology. When he was young, Don explored the woods and lakes and streams of southern Indiana, where he's from, and Michigan, and later the pine barrens and coastal marshes of New Jersey and the forests of West Virginia. After arriving in Madison in 1978, Professor Waller began to explore the habitats of Wisconsin. Some of his graduate students and colleagues drew him into doing research up in northern Wisconsin and the UP, studying how deer affect tree regeneration and the forest community. Over the past 12 years, he and his students have been revisiting plant communities first surveyed in the 1940s and 50s. They're learning how habitat fragmentation, deer, pollution, invasive species are all driving long-term changes in the forest. It also spurred Don to assemble a collection of stories on how Wisconsin is changing into a book called The Vanishing Present: Shifts in Wisconsin's Lands, Waters, and Wildlife, which was published in 2008. Tonight, Don will be discussing how deer and plants affect each other. After you hear all that Don has discovered about the impacts of deer, you may not be surprised that he has taken up bow hunting. You probably know, here's a little trivia question. You probably know that professors need to publish their research. For years, believe it or not, Don had a hard time getting his research published because people simply would not believe his findings that deer have such an enormous effect on forest trees. Now his research papers are A, boycotted by the deer who are suing him for libel, B, cheered and praised by the trees, or C, turned down yet again because the publisher thinks deer impacts are so obvious no one needs to read about them anymore. This is clearly another example of you just can't win. All right, now turning to Tim Van Deelen. He is an associate professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at UW-Madison. He was educated in Michigan and Montana. He was a professor and worked in Illinois, and he was a wildlife researcher with the Wisconsin DNR up here in Rhinelander before coming to UW-Madison as a professor. Tim Van Deelen and his students study not only deer, but other animals as well, including beaver, badgers, and cougars. What a cool job. He and his students have been studying the 30-year record of the survival and population growth of gray wolves in Wisconsin. They're also studying the effects of the new wolf hunting season and whether there is a critical minimum population size necessary for wolves to survive. Tonight, Tim will speak about his research on many aspects of white-tailed deer in the Midwest, including fawn mortality, deer on the Apostle Islands, adult deer survival, and chronic wasting disease. Now, here's an anecdote that Tim shared with me. Tim did his dissertation work in the UP in a project that was sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service, and he drove one of those, funny green trucks that they all drive. He was way back in the forest one day in the spring when a group of elderly people in a sedan flagged him down, assuming he was someone official. They had what Tim thought was a very strange question. Can we take leaks from the woods? Well, Tim laughed, and he assured them that it was perfectly fine to take a leak in the woods, and that, in fact, he took a leak as often as he needed to. Just don't make a show of it, he said. They all looked at him like he was crazy. It was only when he was driving away that it dawned on him. The forest floor was covered with wild leeks. A lesson that it's always a good idea to know a little botany. All right, thank you, and here is Tim Van Deelen.
Wow, thank you very much for the welcome. Thank you for dinner, for the sponsors. It's good to be back up in Minocqua. I'm a little homesick every day for my home in Lake Tomahawk, especially when I'm sitting in traffic trying to get downtown. The topic here, well, let me back up. The theme of science on tap, I think, is appropriate. Science has been in the news lately a lot, having to do with deer management and wolf management. And frankly, the science is the easy part. And my hunch is that that'll become clear when we begin doing more of the discussion. So a couple of points that I think I should make in introduction is really something that Don and I discussed on the way up here, is that the management of our fantastic, wonderful, world-class deer resource here in Wisconsin, the thing that is so valuable, the thing that we argue and fight about, can't be considered in isolation. It's connected to the plants in the Northwoods. It's connected to our culture, to our recreational activities, to the economy of the Northwoods, and it's also connected to the other animals. And probably the most controversial, and one that we'll probably talk more about, has to do with our new wolf population. And by new, I mean recovered, not new in the sense that it doesn't belong here or hasn't been here. So the big story, of course, in deer management has been the implementation of something called the Deer Trustee Report. As part of Governor Walker's campaign, he promised to have a deer trustee look at deer management in Wisconsin. The deer trustee enlisted 2 other scientists who came and took a comprehensive look at all aspects of deer management. That turned into a report. Over the summer, a citizens group met for several Saturdays at Stevens Point to talk about implementation of the report. That process is coming to a head now with a package of rules that's before the Natural Resource Board, recommending changes to deer management in Wisconsin. And so much of the current controversy, and I always have to be careful to say that it's not a new controversy. We've been arguing about deer and deer management here at least as far back as Aldo Leopold himself. But most recently, the issue of the scientific content of that report, or the degree to which we would continue to insist on rigorous science in our deer management, has been something controversial. And some of you may have known that a week or 2 ago I was in front of the Natural Resources Board. I was invited to talk a little bit about this. And so some of the comments I'm going to make to you are messages that I wanted to give to the Natural Resources Board. One of the key messages is Wisconsin has a world-class deer resource. Every year the Quality Deer Management Association puts out what they call the Whitetail Report. And what the report does is it takes a comprehensive look at deer management, particularly from the point of view of hunters across North America. And they do this, they've been publishing this online for the past 5, 6, 7 years. And the patterns really don't change much from one year to the next, but I'm going to describe for you the 2013 report. Now, one of the things that's unique about Wisconsin when you compare it to our neighbors in what's considered the 13 states of the Midwest is that Wisconsin has had and has a relatively aggressive harvest of antlerless deer. But if you look at the number of bucks that we shoot, it does not decline. There's not a relationship with declining number of bucks harvested with an increasing number of antlerless deer harvest. What you see is an association, meaning that as you increase the antlerless harvest, you also increase the antlered harvest. You increase the buck harvest. And if you look at that relationship for the 13 states in the Midwest, Wisconsin is right at the top of the heap. We harvest more deer, both bucks and antlerless deer, than any of our neighbors do. Now you can also pay your $50 and sign up for the Boone and Crockett Club, which gives you access to their trophy harvest database. And if you look at that database, you also see that there's a relationship between the antlerless harvest and the number of trophy bucks that are harvested. And it's a positive relationship, meaning that the more antlerless deer you harvest per square mile of area, the higher your probability of harvesting, or reporting rather, a Boone and Crockett trophy. And if you look over the past 3 years of that trophy database, what you see is that Wisconsin not only is the highest in the Midwest, it's the highest in the country. So part of what you get from having this aggressive antlerless harvest is the higher probability that you're going to shoot one of those wall hanger deer, one of those once-in-a-lifetime deer. And just to give you a little flavor, our habitat and hunting traditions are most closely related to those in Michigan and Minnesota, and we harvest 3 times as many trophy deer as Minnesota and Michigan do. Now you can look at hunter success. And you can ask, well, does hunter success change when you change the antlerless harvest? And if you look at the 13 Midwestern states, about eight of them track hunter success. There's really no relationship between hunter success and the magnitude of the antlerless harvest. Wisconsin is about the middle of the pack. So I think our hunter success rate is something like 40%, meaning that for every license that we sell, something like 40% of those turn into a deer tagged. And that's really remarkable because Wisconsin, among all of its neighbors, has the most restrictive gun season. We have this 9-day season. We compress all of our activity into 9 days. You can look within Wisconsin. You can look at the 72 counties in Wisconsin, and you can ask yourself the same questions. And what you find is there's the same relationship. You tend to shoot more bucks where you shoot more does. And that remains true when you control for the fact that some counties are simply bigger than others and have bigger deer herds. But also there's this trophy relationship. In our counties, where we have more aggressive antlerless harvests, you have higher probabilities of shooting trophy deer. In fact, that increase actually accelerates. And if you look across the different habitats that we have in Wisconsin, you find that that relationship is stronger in the southern part of the state and in the west central part of the state, which have traditionally been kind of our big deer areas. So if I boil that down, the message that I try to give to deer hunters when I give these sorts of talks is, these are the good old days. We have a good thing going. The statistics bear this out. The problem we run into, and this is something that people who study the sociology of deer management understand, is that there is a trade-off. And that trade-off for having high antlerless harvests is that you see fewer deer in the woods relative to what you might see under management regimes like you see in Michigan and Minnesota. And I think what gets lost in many of the controversies here is the nature of that trade-off. We could be like Michigan and Minnesota, but what we would do is we would carry more deer through the winters, over the years. More deer means more plant impacts, and I'm not going to say much more about this because the world expert on that topic is sitting next to me. But that antlerless harvest also means more venison in the freezer for the average hunter. And if you're one of those hunters who really keys into harvesting a trophy buck, it means, relative to our neighboring states, a 3 times higher probability that you're going to connect with one of those Boone and Crockett bucks. How's my time? Okay, so we've got a good thing going. This is a coupled system. The new hot topic might be the nature of wolves in this system, and so we can talk about that a little bit. One of my students has been studying the population dynamics of wolves. The wolf population on its own appears to be slowing down. I always get asked about the impact of wolves on our deer herd, and we've got my lab, in cooperation with the Wisconsin DNR, has been studying deer mortality in 2 study areas. One is up by Winter, and one is in the west central part of the state by Shiocton. This is a collaboration with my DNR colleagues that I'm very proud of. But what we're finding there is, yeah, wolves eat deer. They're sort of specialized to do that, but the relative number of deer that are being taken in our northern study areas is relatively small. It's about 1 in 20 deer on an average winter, and on a mild deer, it's about 1 in 30. Now, just to put that in context, about 1 in 5 deer will be killed by a hunter. So, the wolves are taking some fraction of what the hunters are. Now, right away, I can see somebody's blood pressure is rising. And they're getting ready to tell me that that's not what I'm experiencing. And that's true. What we have in Wisconsin is the ability to track the population with pretty high precision. And if you really want to get into the weeds on precision, I can do that. But we can get pretty high precision on deer population trends at the deer management unit level. Now, for most of us, for most of you, your perception of the deer population trend is what you're seeing under your tree stand. And what's going on at the deer management level is only distantly related for many of us to what's happening under our tree stand. So, are there wolf impacts that are being experienced by hunters? Well, sure there are. Some people can, if you're one of those people who's unlucky enough to put a tree stand up on what had been a wolf rendezvous site all summer, you're going to probably see very few deer. So what we're seeing is, or what we think we're seeing is, at some level, wolves are probably not so much impacting the numbers of deer. I've looked at this to the extent that we have data available on it, but what I think, and this is my opinion having studied it a little bit, is that we're seeing a change in behavior. And there's some precedence in the historical, or rather the scientific literature for this. And that's maybe a good thing, because as you'll find out, that variation in deer presence on the landscape might be critically important to conserving some of the plants that are very sensitive to deer browsing. And I think the wider discussion we need to have as managers, as scientists, as deer hunters, is how do we find a way to live with that kind of a changing dynamic? And that's maybe where I can turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks very much, Tim. You're a great companion for a long drive, and I also appreciate the explanation for why my tree stand isn't getting enough deer. It's a wolf rendezvous site right underneath it. I'm impressed to see this crowd. Thanks a lot for showing up. I'm impressed to see the interest. We have a huge interest in deer. We have a huge interest in wolves, and I'll get to plants soon too. But it's interesting in terms of the recent public and political events that Tim referred to, that we haven't seen a lot of public involvement in deer politics, apart from a vocal group of hunters. So I just encourage you to all be thinking about that in the back of your mind while you discuss these things amongst ourselves. What are deer? You can answer that in a variety of ways. It's an ungulate with a multi-chambered stomach that tends to be a generalist and so forth. Or you could say, deer, it's Bambi. Bambi is our image of deer that many of us grow up with. Or you might see, as Tim has alluded to, deer as a rack mounted on the wall. You might see deer as meat in the freezer. You might see deer as a vector of Lyme disease or chronic wasting or bovine tuberculosis. You might see deer as a cause of 50 or 60,000 accidents per year in the state of Wisconsin. You might see deer as a beautiful animal, a graceful animal. And deer are all these things. Deer are the only big mammal most of us are likely to see. And that makes them very special in our state. North America has gone from having more genera and species of large mammal than any continent on Earth 15 or 20,000 years ago, to being the continent, apart from Antarctica, that has the fewest genera and species of large mammal on Earth. That's a huge change, and one that I think all of us feel on some level. For me, though, and what I want to talk about, deer are something else. Deer are a keystone herbivore. To an ecologist, a keystone species is one that affects many other species, and not in a small way, but in a fairly significant or important way. Plant species present on the island, as you might expect, responded pretty sensitively to whether the deer were there or not. But when she compared the effects of deer populations in the 1950s and 60s to what was present in 1995, to the effects of deer densities and populations in the late 70s and 80s and early 90s, she found a curious thing. She found that it was the abundance of deer 50 years ago that was a better statistical predictor of what the plant community was like than the deer densities had been in the last 20 years. What that means, I think you can appreciate, is that the effects that deer are having in our woods now are not just affecting the woods for a short period of time. They're affecting our woods for half a century, perhaps a century or more into the future. This was interesting to me and led to another line of work. For the last dozen years or so, my group has been systematically resurveying sites, forested sites in southern and northern Wisconsin that were first surveyed by John Curtis and his students, a famous plant ecologist who worked out of Madison back in the 40s and 50s. And here we had, instead of just a dozen or so tree species to concern ourselves with, we had a couple of hundred species. Most of the diversity of forests is in the understory, and most of it is herbaceous. It's not woody. And what we discovered was that there have been profound changes in the Northwoods in most places, but not all places. Curiously, the places that have not changed, I mean, I mentioned those failures of regeneration. There's one set of areas that have not changed in terms of overall plant diversity and that are showing very good patterns of regeneration of hemlock and cedar and other species. Can you guess? You're not allowed to answer these questions. A certain subgroup over here, but can you guess what those areas are? Your backyard. I want to visit it. Well, what's that?
Tribe?
Yes, the tribal lands. The Menominee, the Lac du Flambeau, the Lac-Coudray, Bad River to some extent. We don't have many sites there, but it was remarkable to me to see that these changes that were profoundly affecting many landscapes seemed to be curiously absent in many of the Indian tribal lands in northern Wisconsin. And of course, those were the lands that were closer to 10 deer per square mile than the 20 or 30 or 40 that occupy many other landscapes. Finally, I just want to finish up by talking about a result we just got within the last year or so. Kind of if you're trying to get a grant proposal funded, or if you're trying to get a paper accepted in a prestigious journal, often what they want in ecology, which has been criticized in the past for being descriptive, is you need a rigorous experiment. We're real scientists. We're going to use rigorous experimental approaches. And the rigorous experimental approach for testing deer impacts, of course, is to build a fence, what we call an exclosure, something to keep the deer out. And we've been building a lot of fences in the landscapes of northern Wisconsin. We put in, for example, about 70 fenced exclosures around hemlock seedlings back in 1991. And we finished that 20-year experiment in 2011. And we're writing that up right now. In fact, we got a meeting later this teaching us today is that, and what Tim mentioned too, is the need to manage the system as a system, to recognize the interconnections, to understand the keystone roles that some species are playing, and to understand that deer may be playing a key role here. There's been a lot of talk in the state of Wisconsin over the last few years about why deer seem to be decreasing in abundance. The DNR is being blamed conspicuously for their failures. We're insisting on hiring Dr. Deere from Texas to do the Kroll report. And the question I've not heard being asked by anyone in the DNR or any one of the hunter groups is it possible that the reason deer may be decreasing, as they are apparently in some areas, possibly due to resources? Possibly due to the fact that they might be eating themselves out of house and home. Thank you very much. Keith.
I'd like to ask you, I can be frightened enough about overrunning deer, but make a few comments about earthworms.
Keith McCaffrey is asking about another one of the apparently keystone species that's acting on forest ecosystems right now, and that's the invasion of Eurasian earthworms, in particular the large night crawlers into our forest. They've generally radiated out from boat landings and occur in areas where there are roads or logging equipment where they tend to get spread. And earthworms appear to be having fairly profound effects in forests by chewing through a lot of the leaf litter area. A leaf litter on the forest floor where many of the forest wildflowers tend to root. And the immediate effect is to eliminate the rooting zone and for many of those species to disappear and the herb layer to get much sparser. So the question implied behind Keith's question, if I can take it a step further, is maybe are there interactions between white-tailed deer and earthworms.
I just get doubly frightened.
Yes. Or maybe could the earthworms be accounting for the changes that we're attributing to deer? And that's a really kind of an important question, one that we're trying to answer right now. I think in the case of earthworms, a key question is whether their effects might be transitory. When they eliminate the leaf litter, clearly lots of plants die. But of course, these plants, if you go back before glaciation, there were native earthworms. These plants had coexisted with earthworms in the long ago periods. So I wonder whether the big crashes we're seeing now due to earthworms may be followed by a gradual pattern of recolonization. But with many of these, what most people, when you go into a forest, most people, if you ask them, is the forest healthy or not? What's forest health in northern Wisconsin? They'll stare up into the canopy and they'll say, yes, it's a beautiful forest. It's a lovely forest. It looks very healthy. And that's our instinct. But what I've learned to do as an ecologist is to look at my feet, to look at the forest floor, and to try and assess, am I seeing seedlings? Am I seeing a diversity of wildflowers? Am I seeing evidence of the future of the forest, the next generation? And I don't know the answer, to make a long answer short. But it's something we're investigating now.
Can I just ask, since you just touched on it, forest health is something people talk about a lot. A lot of people think if you see a standing dead tree or a snag, that you have an unhealthy forest. If you just touch upon that, because I think that's something people actually think they're keeping a forest healthier if they don't have down woody debris or standing woody debris, and they're doing their forest a favor if they're clearing all that out. Could you just touch upon that, please?
Yeah, those standing dead trees. Oh, I'm sorry. The question is to make a few the comment was to please make a few comments about forest health relative to the presence of dead trees, either standing or on the ground. And, my training is in wildlife ecology, wildlife management, and certainly those dead trees are vitally important for cavity nesting birds, for cavity nesting mammals. When they fall over, they become foraging substrate for things like flying squirrels. Salamanders live under them. They produce lots of insects and ants that bears and such eat. Frankly, I think if you would talk to DNR forest ecologists, they would tell you the same thing, that a certain presence of those dead trees on the landscape is a very good thing. In fact, the research that's going on by Star Lake is trying to quantify the effect of some of that by manipulating the amount of coarse dead woody material that they leave on the ground, and also manipulating the amount of snags, the standing dead trees that are left. You're right. A healthy forest, if you want to define health as more of a systems phenomenon, meaning that it also includes the animals and the non-woody plants that live there, would be defined by having some component of dead woody material on the ground and standing snags. Question, yes?
Yeah. As far as the forest ecology, what about all the invasive species of grasses and greens and so forth pertaining to
The question concerns invasive species, which are beginning to come into the Northwoods now, and whether there's a connection with the deer population. I actually had a prospective graduate student in my office yesterday who's doing an investigation of spread of honeysuckle inside the feces of deer scat. And he said he's found a huge amount of germinating honeysuckle seedlings coming out of his deer scat samples, and that he's got 30 or 40 species of plant that are coming out of those deer scat samples. Deer are vectors, as well as all those other roles that deer are playing, and they appear to be benefiting particular species. Deer avoid, by the way, eating buckthorn shrubs. They avoid eating the leaves of honeysuckle. They avoid eating the leaves of garlic mustard. But by not eating those plants, and by eating many of our native plants, they competitively favor those invasions. So in fact, in our studies of areas with more and fewer deer, and with more and fewer invasive plants, we find they seem to be having a synergistic effect. They interact. So the deer and invasive plants together cause a greater decrease in native diversity than either would by itself.
But aren't they spreading it through the scat?
Yes, they give every appearance of aiding and abetting and spreading them. So yeah, but in that case, they're eating the seeds, or flowers. They're not eating the leaves in general.
There was a study proposed, I don't know if it was initiated a couple years ago with Pittman Robinson funds, for the effect of predators on deer, not just wolves, but coyotes and bears and bobcat. Are you aware of that study and what the outcome may be?
Any other questions?
Okay, the question was about a proposed study to look at predators more generally on deer. And the question to me was if I'm aware of that study. I'm a co-PI on that study. That's a study that is sponsored by the DNR, and you're right, the Pittman Robertson money is going into it. We put together an agreement to use that Pittman Robertson money to also leverage some money from the university. So it's a true collaboration. That's the radio collaring study that's going on. There's one study area in the north by Winter, Wisconsin. There's another study area in the west central part of the state by Shiocton, Wisconsin. And we are quantifying, to the extent that you can do this with field research, the predation rates from the full suite of predators that we're picking up preying on white-tailed deer. So in very broad strokes, what you see is predation is more important in the north, where we have larger predators. You see a component of this was a fawn mortality study, where we would search for fawns in the summertime and put expandable radio collars on them and try and measure the amount of mortality that we see in the first 5 weeks of life. And the first 5 weeks are important for a fawn because they're at the hider stage. The mother is out foraging on her own so that she can produce enough milk. The fawn is hiding, usually in thick vegetation. So during that first 5 weeks, we see very high, that's a relative term. We see higher predation in the north than we do in the farm country. Much of that predation that we can detect is black bears. We see a fair amount of coyote predation in both study areas, maybe a little bit higher in the farm country. Let me see here while I'm thinking of it. So through December, in the eastern farmland, it looks like the preliminary estimates are something like a 60% survival rate for fawns in the farm country. You compare that to a much more variable level of survival, which would be somewhere between 20 and 50% for the north. Yeah, gasp. Get that out of your system, because I'm going to tell you another thing that's going to make your blood pressure go up. And that is, most fawns die of something. If it's not a coyote, it's getting hit by a car, it's exposure. We find a lot of starvation, which frankly astonishes me in the farm country. Ungulate populations tend not to be very responsive to variation in fawn mortality. They're much more sensitive to variation in the adult females. So that's a life history strategy that animals like deer have. They just naturally produce far more young than are ever going to survive and reproduce. Yes.
Dr. Van Deelen, considering things we've heard tonight about deer and their effects on forest health, deer car collisions, and what the deer population now will cause the forest to look like 50 years from now, and we're shooting 300,000 deer a year or more, a little bit less maybe. Can you give me the definition of what these are the good old days?
The good old days mean that relative to our peer states and relative to deer hunters across North America, the probability that the average deer hunter can go out, put venison in the freezer, and have a chance at shooting a lifetime buck is higher in Wisconsin than virtually anywhere else. Now, if you define your deer hunting in terms of the number of deer that you count, as opposed to venison in the freezer or the opportunity to shoot a large buck, then that's a trade-off. You can have one, you can have the other. The pattern suggests that you can't have both.
Yes.
In regards to like impacted forest areas being logging years ago, or invasives or what have you, I've heard different philosophies in terms of you need to leave it alone completely and let it do its own thing to recover versus you need to go in and whether it be selectively log or try and control invasives. What do those two different kind of schools of thought, how do those affect wildlife populations in the areas?
That's a really simple question, so I'll turn it over to Tim. No, this is actually a really deep and profound question. The question is, how does forest management really translate into sustainable systems? And if we acknowledge a shared set of broad goals like sustaining diversity in wildlife populations, should we be actively managing by means of, say, selective harvest and maybe active efforts to try and suppress invasive species? Or is a more passive model of management where you back off on the intensity of management and allow succession to proceed and fewer roads to get built to manage that particular land? I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't. I think it's a wonderful and important area for study. I tend a little bit more as an ecologist who studies natural processes to feel as though the burden of proof should be on those who want to actively manage the system to show that it's improving the system. But I do know part of the answer to your question, and that has to do with scale. That has to do with area. The smaller the area in general, the more actively we have to manage it to hang on to natural values. If it's large, you've got natural processes that can operate in a way that they cannot operate in very small patches. One of the particular questions that interest me right now is abilities of plant populations to recolonize, to reestablish themselves after they go locally extinct. We call this the rescue effect in ecology. And it turns out small isolated patches of forest that we're studying in southern Wisconsin have lost this ability. They're losing species, not necessarily because the extinction rate is higher, but because this colonization and recolonization effect is being lost, just because they're small. So proposals to actively manage those areas make a little more sense to me when they're small. Larger, I'm concerned about, there are more better and better BMPs, best management practices now for managing our public forests and often our private forests. Forest certification systems now are paying more attention to the importance of cleaning logging equipment, trying to minimize the spread of invasive earthworms and plant species around the landscape. But we don't have yet long-term studies of the effect of different styles of logging on, say, deer-plant interactions. I think we really need more of that. And Tim and I are trying to collaborate with some folks in the UP to move in that direction.
Okay, I'm a landowner, I have almost a half a square mile. What's the most important thing I should put on the top of my list in the management of that woodland? Because it is mostly woodland.
Hunt it. Sorry, yeah, we should repeat the question. A landowner with half a square mile asks, what should be at the top of the list? What's the most important single management tool to use in managing that land? And I don't know your land. I'd rather take a look at it and walk around.
But it's heavily wooded.
Heavily wooded. What would you say, Tim?
Well, what are your goals?
Well, I'd like to see biodiversity. I'd like to bring back some of the native plants that I wasn't even aware that are missing on my land.
If it's conservation of biodiversity, then Don's right. Hunting is terribly important, but I would also talked to some of the foresters in the Rhinelander office about their experiment at Star Lake in terms of trying to accelerate northern hardwoods towards more of an old growth condition. And there might be some opportunities to create snags, to create down woody material, even as paradoxical as it might sound, to create some small openings, to create more of a three-dimensional structure that you get with an old growth type.
I almost think I have a lot of that. So what's become the popular phrase of German forestry, you're saying that's actually not a correct method.
When German forestry, for those of you who don't know, tends to be fairly intensive, actually very intensive. They tend to be clean forests. They don't leave coarse woody debris around. They're managed actively to sustain high growth rates, except where they've got acid rain that's stopping tree growth. But no, I think I would see German style forestry as being inappropriate if your goals are conservation of biodiversity. And Leopold recognized this himself in '35 when he went to Germany and Austria and said he saw a pattern of forest management incompatible with wildlife and a pattern of wildlife management incompatible with forestry. But by the way, that was the beginning of
Your home, just keep the leafy debris away from the immediate area around your home, but don't go for the entire German forestry concept.
No, I think most of us want a pretty area, of cultivation or whatever right around our homes. But I prefer a messy look, and more foresters are moving in this direction. The messy clear cut, or I've just heard from a forester recently, the very messy selective cut is what they're advocating right now. And it makes a lot of sense in terms of leaving those biological legacies, in terms of allowing local patterns of recolonization and so forth. Good question.
Yes.
I've got a two-part question on how much of the northern forest is actually managed, and when it comes to the DNR, there's a rule in the book that says you have to put your name or ID number on your tree stand or ground blind on DNR managed land. So what is exactly managed land? Do they consider everything in the state managed? Do they sometimes just get overbearing?
I'm not going to touch the tree stand question. Okay, the question was, under the DNR hunting regulations, you have to have your name and phone number on your tree stand or your customer ID on DNR managed land. And the question is, what is managed land? That's the sort of thing I would ask a warden. I just don't know the answer to that one.
And I think
I've asked two wardens, I got two different answers. So I mean, what is exactly, what do you consider managed land?
Public property.
I would assume it would apply to, that essentially all DNR land or all state land would be considered managed by the state.
I think to be safe, and I'm just offering a completely uninformed opinion here, that you would have to assume that any public land is managed in some sense, even if it's even if it's not manipulated.
And state forests are managed by the Division of Forestry within the DNR. So I think
When you go to the national forest, the state, which is the DNR, is not really managing anything in there. That's federal land, the national forest. But you talk to two different wardens, you get two different answers. So I just thought maybe you had something to say on that, but no. Okay, thank you.
Are there programs like with the state or with the DNR, such as they do with the prairie program down in central Wisconsin, where you can burn and still come in and seed and so forth, bring back the natural prairies? Do we have that same program on forest lands?
this is another nice question. He's asking whether we yet have a program in the state of Wisconsin to match what's being done in parts of central Wisconsin to actively restore prairie and savanna lands by assisting with seeding efforts and active restoration. Do we have anything parallel for forests in the north? No. We had the international meeting of the Society for Ecological Restoration in Madison a few weeks ago, and it was conspicuous in their program that forest restoration is in its infancy relative to all the work that's been done in prairie and savanna restoration. It takes longer, for one thing, and there aren't nearly the same kind of public programs or even Nature Conservancy programs to assist with that.
The prairie program is unbelievable.
It's underused?
Huh?
What did you say?
Actually, it's unbelievable. They did some great things down
Yeah, no, it's impressive to see what's being done with prairie restoration right now. I predict within 20 years we'll see much more active work. You can hire half a dozen firms, to help you with an active prairie restoration. If you look in your yellow pages for something on active forest restoration, you won't find a single company. Well, maybe Fred Clark's company does a little bit of that, but anyway, another good question. In the back there.
My question is about the chronic wasting disease and what percentage can we expect to see in the North? And what do you think that would be in the next 5 or 10 years?
The question is about chronic wasting disease and what likely prevalence would we see in the North in the next 5 or 10 years.
What we have now.
What you have now, to the best of our scientific understanding, is about 0 in the Northwoods. Now, it's very difficult to detect a disease that starts out with a very low prevalence. We had an individual deer show up in the northwest of here. Help me out, Keith. Where was that?
Shell Lake.
Okay, Shell Lake area. Given the density of deer that we have in Wisconsin, you'd have to assume that there's a CWD positive out there somewhere. Maybe more than one, but they're very, very difficult to detect at the level of sampling that we do. Now, the scary thing about chronic wasting disease, and this is kind of getting at your question indirectly, is we haven't identified a biological mechanism that would cause it to come to some sort of equilibrium. So the longer you have the disease, at least to the best of our understanding right now, the higher the prevalence is going to go. The thing with chronic wasting disease is that increase in prevalence happens very, very, very slowly. So the models that we look at are captive situations, which is like compressing time. You tend to get a quicker growth rate in captive situations. What we see in Western Dane County now, after, we don't know how long it's been there, but we've been tracking it since 2001. We're talking about a prevalence rate in the deer population that's approaching 10%. In the buck population, I think it's closer to 30%. So maybe one in 3 of the mature bucks that you're harvesting in Western Dane County is likely to be positive. Chronic wasting disease is, by its very nature, a really difficult disease to wrap your mind around it, because it's going to spread, the prevalence is going to increase, but it's going to do so very, very slowly. Question.
I'm curious about why you're asking the question. You're concerned about your own hunting opportunities or the health risk it poses to deer?
More just the health of the deer and what we're going to be exposed to as far as food-wise.
In terms of food, we have some recent results to suggest that humans are not susceptible to the chronic wasting disease prion. There's been no confirmed case of any human disease caused by CWD, and the experiments that have been done suggest that we may dodge that bullet just by the nature of our biochemistry. I'm not advocating eating the brains of chronically wasted deer, but I think it's probably the risk is low.
Now they're saying you shouldn't consume any portion of a deer that's been determined to have CWD, not even the muscle tissue.
Correct. But that's been that way since the beginning.
No, they said brain or spinal.
No, the guidelines since the discovery of chronic wasting disease have been that if you test your deer and it turns out to be positive, don't eat it. The guidelines having to do with nervous tissue, eyes, spinal fluid, that sort of thing, were for many deer, especially the ones that come from the chronic wasting disease zone. And this comes not from the DNR, but from the World Health Organization.
Can you talk about SAC, the sex-age ratio, that's important in deer management?
Oh, we're going to go in the weeds now. The question was about SAC. So SAC is an acronym. SAK stands for Sex Age Kill. And it's the population estimation technique that Wisconsin uses to estimate deer numbers at the DMU level.
We should ask how much time you've got for this.
The calculation really is done in 3 steps. So you have to start out with the number of bucks, and you calculate that from the number of bucks that are reported by hunters divided by some return rate to give you the number of bucks. And then you use the age structure of the population to estimate the adult sex ratio. So if you know the number of bucks, you can multiply it by the adult sex ratio, and you get the number of adult bucks and the number of adult does. Then we in Wisconsin, the DNR does summer deer fawn observations. And so this is field-generated data that is the ratio of fawns to adult does seen during the spring and early summer. So then you can multiply the doe number that you just calculated by the fawn-doe ratio to get the number of fawns in the summer. So now you've got bucks, does, and fawns, and you add those 3 quantities together, and that's SAK. SAK has been argued about in Wisconsin almost as long as it's been used here, and really the number of deer in a deer management unit for most of us is a bit of an abstraction, but it becomes a point of reference that we can argue about deer numbers. The thing people don't realize is that because SAK is based on the harvest, you're estimating some fraction of the total deer herd. You're estimating the number of deer that hunters have access to. So if there's a chunk of deer in the most remote place of the national forest, we're not getting that part of it. We did an audit of SAK back in 2006 where we had a panel of some of the top biometricians in the field come in and look at the SAK. They created a computer model that they created a computer model of a deer population, and then they sampled from that computer model of a deer population to estimate the numbers. And they found out that if you treat SAK like a big dumb algorithm, it has a precision of about 122% plus or minus. And when that came out, people seized on that to say SAK is not working. Well, that's not SAK, that's the model. And what the model was doing was demonstrating what a statistician would call structural problems with the SAK. You can look at the empirical populations of SAK and say, okay, if the populations, well, let me back up. You can't calculate the precision on SAK populations at the DMU level in Wisconsin because we don't have independent counts of the deer. But if you take the number of deer this year and you divide it by the number of deer last year, then the real number of deer last year is in the numerator and the denominator, so it sort of cancels out. So if you look at the ratios, you can estimate precision if you're willing to assume that part of the variation that you're seeing is confounded by the fact that there really is a difference between this year and last year.
Boil that down.
Well, okay, this is where I'm going. This is where I'm going with that. You can compare that process to what happened in the SAK audit and work backwards. And so what you find is that the real precision on SAK estimates in Wisconsin at the DMU level is much closer to plus or minus 30%, with the understanding that some of that difference, some of that plus or minus 30% is a real change from one year to the next. It's not perfect, but over time, it tends to track the deer numbers pretty reliably, I think.
Is it used nationwide?
Well, there are very few states that...
The question was...
The question is SAK used nationwide? The answer is somewhat. There are very few states that put very much effort into estimating deer numbers, and certainly much fewer states that put any effort into estimating deer numbers as rigorously as Wisconsin does. So you see SAK used, for instance, in bear populations in Washington State. Michigan uses a variation on SAK. There's a few other places. It's known in the wildlife literature, but it isn't used as prominently in other states, to my knowledge, the way it is in Wisconsin.
The importance of that quantitative database, so really undergirds the high evidence on which we talked about the full enforcement of the management system in the state.
Right, so the comment there is that putting all that effort into quantifying deer numbers really is needed to justify the high antlerless harvests. And the high antlerless harvests have payoffs in terms of conservation of our plant resources, our biodiversity, but also in terms of venison in the freezer, trophy potential, and some of the other things that deer hunters care about. And so it fits into our earlier discussion about what some of the trade-offs are in deer management.
I wanted to just add here that Pennsylvania, which in many ways is sort of a dystopia of what the future of Wisconsin forests might be, and that they've had chronically high deer densities across much of the Allegheny Plateau for the last 50 years, to the point where they're now losing all forest regeneration, and the forests are converting to what they call fern parks, with ferns and sedges in the understory and trees gradually with a canopy breaking up. But in Pennsylvania, interestingly enough, they're actually moving away from trying to count deer, which is expensive and sometimes error prone, and instead focusing on the plant impacts themselves. In other words, they're saying, let's base deer management not on how many deer we think are in a given area, but on what the clear impacts are on their habitat conditions, how much food or habitat is there for the deer. And I think that's an alternative, represents a possible alternative to over-reliance on SAK. I personally like to know what the deer density is, but I'll tell you, it's cheaper to count plants than it is to count deer.
Before we take another question, can I just poll the group and see if we want to take a short break? Or do you want to take a short break, or do you want to just keep going? Can we get a groundswell? Keep going. Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Question?
I guess I'll address the elephant in the room. So, what you know based on your research and things, and I'm not well educated on this, but what do you feel about the Dr. Deer notion of implementation, like fence hunting and things like that? That may be a possibility here, or?
So this is a question about elephants. Elephants are wildlife, so I'll turn this over to Tim.
The question was, what do we think about the Dr. Deer report, the Deer Trustee Implementation Report? There's good and bad. There's a recurrent theme in the Dr. Deer report is trying to incorporate more local knowledge into deer management decisions. And I think that's a very good thing. DNR has proposed to do this. Sometimes this business about incorporating local knowledge is presented as sort of a challenge to science, in the sense that on the one hand you can apply science to deer management, but on the other hand you can apply local knowledge into the deer management process. And I think that that's a false dichotomy. I think what you need to do is, if there's a reason why there's a whole separate field of wildlife science devoted to human dimensions, and it has to do with scientifically and rigorously trying to understand what public opinion is on deer management. And I think that's what really needs to be incorporated into moving the deer trustee implementation process forward. Now, some of the other things that came out of the process talk about de-emphasizing, for instance, the use of SAK, which I would disagree with, because number one, I think SAK is nowhere near as imprecise as it's been sold to be. And part of the discussion, or part of the criticisms of SAK has been either a misunderstanding or a misreading of the science on the topic, so that they seize on the precision in the model in the abstract rather than the way it's actually used and applied in Wisconsin. A big component of SAK has to do with something called DMAP, which is Deer Management Assistance Program. The idea here is that there will be a formal process for landowners to get assistance from DNR biologists, and probably, because of the workload, eventually consulting biologists on deer management. Now, again, this is a way to engage the public in active management. I think that's a very good thing. One of the things that I think is missing in that discussion is the question of cumulative impacts. If every person on the landscape with a hunting 40 or a hunting 80 or a hunting 160 decided to put a bunch of food plots in, cut all their hardwoods and convert it to aspen, suddenly we'd be neck deep in deer, and all of our overabundance problems would just be exacerbated. So I think there are some good points in it. I think there are some points where we need to step back and look a little bit. What I would hate to see come out of that is somehow turning away from the rigorous scientific deer management that's been the hallmark, seriously, it's been the hallmark of deer management in Wisconsin stretching back to the 1960s. And again, I got to point to the statistics on things like venison in the freezer, trophy potential. There are measurable quantities out there that really demonstrate that whatever the managers in Wisconsin have been doing here, despite all the controversies that are so familiar to us, the results that we're showing in Wisconsin are really pretty positive. And one of the things that really gets missed in the DTR final report is 2 points that the authors of the report made. One has to do with the controversies that we always deal with in Wisconsin. And they point to those controversies and they say, you know, you got to be careful here, because the way things are set up, it could be many of those controversies are driven by a small number of people who just make it their mission to be critical. The other thing is, and this would be the closing paragraphs of the narrative in that report, talk about, and it's even titled The Admonition. And that has to do with unrealistic expectations. If you have, as you have in Wisconsin, very high harvest rates, good success rates, very high trophy potential, then somebody has to ask the question about how much harder can you push this? How much better do you really expect to make things? How realistic is it to think that we can improve on 50 years of experience doing these things? And one thing that's missing from the discussion of implementing the DTR has to do with managing hunters' expectations.
Did that answer your question? Question?
I was wondering if you guys could discuss the impact of baiting on hunter success and on deer impacts.
All right, we're going to go for the trifecta. We were actually able to study baiting, because when CWD happened...
The question
Oh, the
here.
question is, I'm sorry, the question has to do with what are the effects of baiting. We were actually able to study this because in connection with CWD, a bunch of counties in Wisconsin decided independently of DNR to outlaw baiting. So we had a natural experiment occurring, and because of the natural experiment, we were able to quantify this. The effect of baiting is a transfer of harvest success. In a nutshell, baiting really doesn't have much of an effect on the number of deer harvested. What baiting does is it creates an opportunity. If you ban baiting, then the gun hunters shoot, or how does this go? If you ban baiting, then the bow hunters shoot slightly more deer. Keith, help me out here. The bow hunters shoot slightly more, the gun hunters shoot slightly less, and it's a bit of a wash. Now, that's the harvest outcomes. The disease outcomes, probably the most significant thing would be the finding that the CWD prion is detectable in saliva. There's also research, published research out of Michigan, that shows that bovine tuberculosis can be transmitted on a bait pile because the saliva gets on the corn and the disease organism can live in a frozen state on the corn for several days up to a week. If you put those two pieces of information together, it's reasonable to suggest that baiting creates a risk in terms of transmitting chronic wasting disease. So certainly the disease issue is out there. Yeah, maybe that's enough for now.
Part of my question was for Don of the impacts on the forest, and I would just presume that would just concentrate impacts, and that would be the effect?
Yeah, let me tell, the question here is whether baiting concentrates the impact of deer. And I want to say two things. First of all, our colleague Keith McCaffrey expresses a lot of concerns about not just whether people are baiting deer or not and how it's affecting local success, but more globally, if you've got tons, if you've got hundreds of tons of bait and feed going out on the landscape, and deer near the northern limit of their range, and here in northern Wisconsin, then are you affecting overwinter survival to the extent that you're increasing the deer herd itself and consequent downstream impacts on the forest? And I share Keith's concern there. I think this is a very real threat and something that should be studied more. Keith, do you have anything to add there?
No, it's good. It's changing the productivity and survivorship of deer, and it's also changing our behavior and distribution.
So it's,
Compounding harvest.
to repeat what Keith just said, that baiting is so large a phenomenon now. I mean, you go to every convenience store in the region and you see this stuff being sold, that it's affecting their behavior, it's affecting their survival, it's affecting their demographics, and it seems highly likely that it's affecting ultimately their impacts in forests.
Can I break in?
Sure.
I mean, because one of the problems with understanding baiting effects is we don't have a good measure of it on the landscape. Keith, who has been watching deer management in Wisconsin for 130 years, he says that baiting really didn't take off until, thank you, about the 1990s. And if you believe that there's sort of a pre-baiting and a post-baiting period that's kind of delineated by the 1990s, what you find is that in the north, in the northern units here, the growth rates got faster after the 1990s, despite the fact that the deer densities were higher. And that would suggest that there's some input from baiting.
I just can't resist telling a story. My family has a cabin on the shores of Drummond Island at the east end of the Upper Peninsula. And I once was talking to a forester up there. The southern part of that island is covered by beautiful white cedar forests. And the northern part of the island is hardwoods with a fair bit of aspen. And they were cutting a lot of aspen, and I was asking them about this. I saw deer impacts on the orchids, the yellow lady slippers, and on the white cedar regeneration on our part of the island. And I said, why are you cutting so much aspen in the northern part of the island? And the answer was, well, we've got a problem with too many deer eating the cedar on the south side of the island. So we're cutting the aspen and leaving the logging tops on the north side of the island to draw the deer away from the cedars. And he seriously thought that would solve the problem. And again, if you just look forward a generation or two and the overall increase of the deer herd, I think you can appreciate that's a short-sighted solution. Question?
Yeah, this is going along with the baiting. I have some concerns for GMO corn. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the quality of the deer.
So the question is about the fact that most corn planted now in this state and across the country is a GMO or genetically modified corn, and whether, if that's also going into the bait, then are the deer in fact getting genetically modified corn? And that's because you'd like to sell your deer as organic, right?
I know there's been lots of studies in domesticated animals, cow and pig, that there's, a lot of impacts feeding them genetically modified corn.
What kind of impacts do you think, or have you seen reported for feeding GMO corn to pigs and other?
Yeah. There's a lot of data on these domesticated animals getting sick and farmers, having their herds turn around because they stop feeding them GMO corn.
And it's not the overuse of antibiotics in feed. Do you think it's the GMO corn itself?
Of course, that has an effect, but the GMO corn, it's strict data on the results of GMO corn and then stopping.
Okay, I can't comment on that because I haven't seen those studies.
I'm not aware of any research that's looked at that.
Taking it a step further, I've had questions in my office whether or not we should allow corn from southern Wisconsin to be allowed as bait in northern Wisconsin. Now that Koreans have been found to be picked up in a well.
That's true. That's a very recent finding, just from a month or 6 weeks ago, that the prions from chronic wasting disease that end up in the soil are taken up by plants and are present in the plants. So I think that's a legitimate concern and a legitimate question. Do you know if it's being addressed, Tim?
Not to my knowledge, but that research is so brand new. I mean, we're at the stage where people are starting just to ask about it, and I don't think people have done the risk analysis yet.
Yeah. Question?
Just an observation, I've been hunting deer for 40 years, and deer hunters have been whining for 40 years about deer numbers. And we talk about hunter expectations, so I'm wondering, why isn't there a psychologist up there?
There are issues behind us.
In a way, I'm serious about that. I mean, how do you get past
So
their beliefs?
to repeat the question, if we see deer hunters complaining about there not being enough deer and the way the DNR is managing the herd, but in fact that these complaints have gone back 40 years, then we're into this domain that Tim referred to as social factors, human factors. Of course, hunters are different from fishermen in that regard. Fishermen always are happy with the size of the fish and the number of fish they catch, but we need more social science. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I agree with Don. I would just make the observation, since you know that I used to work for Science Services, is that I think part of the reason that we get into these controversies, not just with deer but with other wildlife species, has to do with the fact that we've really seized on the science. So, Aldo Leopold really asked us to look at three things when it came to wildlife management. He really asked us to really nail the science, to really be aware of the ethics, and really to work on the aesthetics, or what would be the beautiful, the attractive way to do this. And we took the low-hanging fruit. We really pushed on the science. But in many cases, we haven't talked about the ethics very much, and we haven't moved very far on the aesthetics, because that gets into subjectivity. And we're much more comfortable with science because we like to think that there is a right and wrong, a yes or no, a quantifiable answer out there. And so what you see is, not just in the Wisconsin DNR, but in other natural resources agencies, they tend to have lots of specialists who are trained scientists in various branches of science, except for people who deal with education, people who deal with public outreach, and people who deal with the human dimensions. And one of the more positive things that I've seen happen in the DNR recently has been the fact that they've hired a really crack, and I mean that in a good way, a really productive, well-regarded human dimensions scientist who's now working in their Science Services branch. So I hope that we're turning the corner on that, because you're absolutely right. One of the reasons that chronic wasting disease management, I think, really ground to a halt was that we could not sell the program. We couldn't convince the people on the ground, the landowners and the hunters, that this was important for the long term. And that's not the realm of population biologists or botanists. That's the realm of human dimension specialists. So it's good to see that that expertise now is being brought into the agency.
Can you recommend any psychologists?
I I guess allowing the bartenders.
We need more bartender. Let's hear it for the bartender.
A simple question. I've had the benefit of knowing my great-grandfathers, my grandfathers, and my father. These are my great-grandfather, born in the mid-1800s, and he moved to the northwoods, actually Minnesota. And his stories about the number of deer, and you're talking about, we're living in the good old days. Do you have any comment on what you think the deer population now compared to, say, around the turn of the century, 1900 plus?
The question is, given that our perspective tends to be pretty short-term, and what do we really know about what deer densities were, say, at the turn of the 20th century? I was looking at a map of deer densities across the state of Wisconsin from 1929 and comparing it to the current 2012 DNR deer figures. And I noticed a lot of the counties in southern Wisconsin said none, and that many of the counties here in northern Wisconsin had numbers of like 50 or 100 or 200. So densities by the 1920s were low. They were extinct in many states in the eastern and lower Midwestern US. They were extinct in many counties in southern Wisconsin. If you go back to the mid-1800s, of course, then you're talking about a previous time when the forests were just beginning to be harvested, when Indian populations were very low, and when European settlers were moving into the region. And so the population of deer is considered by most people who've looked into this to be on the range of 4 to 8 or 5 to 10 deer per square mile of available habitat. Back then, before European settlement here in this northern part of the state. And that's considerably below the densities that we have now. The concern the DNR, many of the DNR people and scientists have, is that deer are remarkably prolific. There's a reason why moose went extinct in Wisconsin, why elk went extinct in Wisconsin, why woodland caribou and bison went extinct in Wisconsin, but white-tailed deer did not. And that is that white-tailed deer have a high reproductive rate. You can get a population increase on the order of 40 or even 50% in parts of more agricultural regions, I believe. That's remarkable for a big mammal to be able to grow that fast. It makes it resilient even to fairly heavy hunting. But it also represents a danger, I would argue, a threat, in that a rapid population increase can occur even if we only have a few years of relaxed hunting pressure.
Yeah, in the 1940s, the argument was over 200,000 deer in Wisconsin. And the editors of papers in the north here were saying that Aldo Leopold was just this crazy nutcase ivory tower professor down in Madison. There couldn't possibly be 20,000 deer in Wisconsin. And, nowadays, if we shot 20,000 deer, people would come unglued because the harvest was too low. So we've got relatively good numbers since about the 1940s, and the population's been increasing statewide. It peaked sometime in the 1990s, and it's been trending down a little bit recently. But if you want to define the good old days as high deer population densities in Wisconsin, we're pretty close.
Yes?
Speaking of deer populations, what do you attribute the localized albino population?
The question concerned why do we see local populations of albino deer? There's a pending rule change, I believe it is, or is it a law before Wisconsin legislature to ban the hunting of white deer? Tim, this is yours.
Palage, those palage anomalies, like the most common one is albinos. There's a melanism, which is deer that have black palage. Occasionally in the UP and even here you get deer with very long eyelashes. Those are genetic mutations. So if it shows up randomly and that individual breeds, then its offspring or its kin have a high likelihood of having that trait. And I don't know if it's strictly Mendelian, but if it is, then what happens is if sibs begin breeding with others, then you start getting a pocket of that sort of thing.
think I would probably look around and say you're kind of preaching to the choir, but it's a wealth of knowledge you're giving us, so thank you very much. But if we're going to inflict or spread on social change, what would one piece of nugget, it might be a repeat of what you've already said, but what's one piece of information or nugget that we could take on to our neighbors or to fellow hunters or hunters to manage the deer population and ecology for the forest or the herd itself?
So the question is, given the range of concerns you've heard about tonight, what's the take-home message? What should be done in terms of individual action or involvement on the part of us? We had the answer or the question before about, I own a piece of land, how should I manage it? And hunting was one suggestion there. I'll give you a couple of suggestions, things that I'm trying to push right now, and I would appreciate assistance or help with. And one of them is saying yes to data. I think information is important. We've seen it can also be controversial in the case of the SAK model, but I don't think we have enough information on deer browsing in the woods. I'd like to see a statewide deer habitat health monitoring system involving citizen scientists, involving hunters, involving high school science teachers and their students, involving school forests, where we would use fenced exclosures, we would use DNR tree seedlings, we would use transplants of flowers perhaps too, to assess locally, and maybe feeding into this deer map program advocated by the Deer Trustee Report. Feed in data locally and train hunters in particular and those who care about ecological things, and to recognize, I mean, you can teach any 7th grader how to count the number of browsed versus unbrowsed twigs on a sugar maple sapling. That's been used since the 1980s as a quick and easy index of what the deer impacts are, at least in the summertime. And so some kind of citizen science monitoring program, I think, would be a win-win-win. It would be a win for the citizens who got out in the woods more and began to notice, educate themselves on these changes. It would be a win for the hunters who would begin to understand the connection between the deer and the habitat conditions and recognize when overbrowsing is occurring. It would be a big win for the DNR, who would be working side by side with hunters and with the public instead of at loggerheads, as they have sometime in the past. And it would be a big win for science because we'd be getting the data we really need to understand the system. I'd also like to see hunter safety education modified to include more ecology. And it's concerning to me that when I've suggested that idea to various people in the past, they say there's no time, there's no room in the curriculum for teaching them anything about the ecology of the system that, I mean, you're a hunter, you're a predator, you're in the system for better or worse. Wouldn't it make sense to teach people something about what that role is? And yet, you know, that hunter safety training is very compressed. If you want a hunting license in Germany, do you know how many hours of effort you need to put in? It's a semester long. I mean, it's literally, it's 100 or 150 hour course or something. What's that?
100 hours.
100 hours. And you need to know the history, you need to know the culture, and you're darn sure you need to learn something about the ecology of those systems before, and you have to take an exam, before you can gain that license. I'm not in favor of German forestry, and I'm not in favor of German 100-hour courses either, but you'd think we could spare an hour or two on that.
I have kind of two pieces of advice, and I'll be real brief here because there's a question in the back. But the first is to become involved. It was really kind of eye-opening that something as big and prominent as the implementation of the Deer Trustee Report, where the DNR put out the call far and wide to come and participate in Stevens Point on these Saturdays during the summer, drew so very few people. And it was the same people. It was the same ones, I call them the deer nerds, and I am one, that show up to argue about deer numbers. We need more people to show up, more people to comment, more people to get involved, especially people who value the deer herd and understand what a good thing we've got going. So that's number one. Number two is own this legacy. Love it. Celebrate it. Venison is the best meat in the world. Share it. Cook it for people. Give it away at Christmas time, but bring people in and help them recognize what a fantastic resource we really have here in Wisconsin. Be an evangelist about it.
This may be anecdotal here, but I hunted back in the 40s, and we always had 12 deer hunters that were out. Before the end of deer season, it was not unusual to see 50 deer in open acres. And at that time, the forest was all at one age. There wasn't much logging. It was all, popple that was getting mature. Since then, we've had excellent forestry practices. The habitat is, I think, 100% better than it was then. The deer population should be a lot higher now, I think, because of the browse that's available. And but I think there's less deer than there were just less hunters than the 40s. And we had the end of deer season, they really, they shot deer everywhere. So I'm watching all these years change. And I know there's a lot of forest ecologists in here that are well educated in science. But I think you should listen to the people more. That's probably what the study was about. Listen to the local people. What do they have to say about it? It's not all science.
I like that question very much, and I respect your knowledge, and that historical knowledge is important, and we tend to lose it pretty rapidly and often discount it. In fact, I've got a whole little rap I give in Tim's class about how we could take individual anecdotes like the one you just told, and if we assembled those systematically, if we consciously sought them out on a local and a regional level and added them up together, you can do science with that. Then it becomes a much more complete story and much more trustworthy than any individual single report. So I think the question was about the fact that deer occurred once in larger aggregations in the 1940s when hunters were fewer and first went out there. And as a hunter myself, I know those aggregations tend to be fewer now. And my question for Tim is whether the increase in the intensity of hunting and the number of hunters may have been instrumental in changing deer behavior, in changing our likelihood to see large aggregations like that.
Well, there are a couple comments to make. In the 1940s, about 2/3 of the state had no deer at all. This sort of speaks to the apples and oranges argument that we get into when we argue about deer numbers at the DMU level. That there's kind of a disconnect. I'm not doubting anything that you say. I'm just saying that that's something that's very difficult to pick up on when the lens you have for looking at the landscape is very coarse. But where we find ourselves right now is we have to make a very pragmatic kind of understanding that right now we have a higher intensity of deer hunter numbers on the landscape than anybody else in the 13 states in the Midwest. We have a lot of pressure on this resource relative to our neighboring states. And we're not going to go back to the 1940s when we had very few deer hunters. We have to figure out a way to manage this resource equitably, if you will, if that's the word. In the 1940s, we were recovering the forest after the cutover, and so yeah, we had lots of young forests which were productive for deer. As you got later into the season, you got natural aggregations. In northern Minnesota and northern Michigan, we still see this phenomenon where deer come together late in the season and they congregate in these deer yards. We've lost that particular behavioral phenomenon in northern Wisconsin, we think. We're not seeing it with our radio collared deer that we have in winter. If you want to think about the mechanisms behind this, it may have to do with the fact that we've got more variation in forest types as you go from one piece of real estate to the next. Again, for some people, the 1940s were the good old days. But if you look at the harvest statistics that we're dealing with in 2013, we're harvesting more deer than we thought we had in the 1940s. And, that may beg the argument about just how many deer and how precise we can count them. But your point was to bring more local knowledge into deer management. That's a big part of the DTR process. That's something that I can endorse as a scientist. And I just want to make the point again that bringing local knowledge into this doesn't mean that you throw away science, because you can bring that local knowledge in a rigorous fashion using the science of human dimensions, sociology, that sort of thing, which is the point that I tried to make to the Natural Resources Board.
This is a follow-up. How positive are you with the X number of per square mile? What you say it is?
Every time you make that statement, you have to have in the back of your mind a certain level of uncertainty. So my best guess of what that level of uncertainty is plus or minus about 30%. So if you say that there's 10 deer per square mile, I'm guessing that in reality it's somewhere between 7 and 13.
Question over here.
I wanted to follow up with the question before that, as far as being more vocal if you're not a deer nerd and you haven't made your voice heard. Because right now, the Deer Trustee Report page on the DNR website has a link for a survey to get public input on the conclusions of the report. So I would recommend that everyone take a moment and fill out that survey. I think it's towards the bottom of the page.
So the comment was, there's the opportunity to fill out a survey on your opinion about the Deer Trustee Report that you can link to from the DNR's website. And the commenter suggested that if you care about this and if you're motivated, you should find that link and let your comments be known. And I guess I would endorse that.
Concerning habitat and forest regeneration, what can private landowners doing to encourage native species to be regenerating, in particular the hemlock and white cedar?
The question concerned how to enhance or encourage the survival and thriving of native biodiversity and plant species in hemlock and cedar forests that might be favored by deer. Is that a fair assessment? So, well, I mentioned hunt the land. That's kind of the most obvious thing. Another question, that this bears back to this anecdote too. We haven't talked about winters and what winters are like up here. But as you know, winters have become milder in northern Wisconsin. And that's important in two respects. First of all, severe winters used to knock down the deer herd in this part of their range every few years, or at least every decade or so, historically. They have not done that since the early 90s in general. I guess there were one or two severe winters, including a couple of years ago. But that's happening less regularly. And so that's tending to enhance overwinter survival and, again, add to this pressure or increase in the deer populations. It's especially this, severity of winters that are important there. The other way that cold temperatures in winter are important is because they tend to cause these aggregations. So it may be that the colder conditions back in the 1940s actually favored those aggregations, and the milder winters in the last couple of decades have meant that many more deer are dispersed across the landscape. They haven't congregated into these deer yarding complexes or deer yard areas. This is actually an active area of research, especially in the UP right now with this group we're trying to get together. But frankly, the wildflowers really get hammered in the springtime. Deer are very hungry at the end of the winter. And so if more deer have survived because the winters are mild, there are going to be more deer feeding on those wildflowers. So short of a cage, protecting them physically, there's not a lot you can do beyond, advocating for lower deer target densities, for following Tim's advice to encourage a high antlerless harvest in your deer management unit. I think that I'll modify that a little bit. Brush can be a natural exclosure. If you've got piles of brush, it can be natural barriers. We found, for example, good hemlock regeneration underneath balsam fir. Balsam fir acted as a screen. I don't know if it was olfactory or visual or just physical, but you get better hemlocks growing underneath balsam fir right now for whatever reason.
Does that encourage growth beyond snap on stage?
What I'm most concerned about is the sort of 10 to 30 centimeter range, and it's growing up beyond that where deer really have what I call the molar zone, where deer have the major effects. So yeah, I'm really concerned about this, but I don't have an easy or quick answer for you. There are some people who believe in, collecting lion poop or pee from the zoo and putting it around their plantings to trying to it actually works, according to a friend of mine. Interesting, this was a couple. The wife said, well, let's get some lion pee or poop from the zoo. And the husband, a professor of animal behavior, said, that's nonsense. There haven't been any lions in this part of the world, in 10,000 years. They went and got the stuff, and it worked, The woman was right after all. But I don't know if you've got enough zoos or enough lion pee and poop up here to make that a viable solution.
We have maybe one more question, and then we'll wrap things up.
You've been patient. I think we all are ready to stand up and move around a little bit. Tim and I are going to stay around for a little bit longer, and happy to talk to folks one-on-one.
One more question.
We have the question.
We'll follow up. We'll finish up with that.
Future trend, thinking in terms of the future, the impacts of fragmentation, forest fragmentation, development, parcelization of forest land, impacts or challenges for the future. Comment?
Yeah, deer have always been, okay, the question is to speculate a little bit about the future with increased development, increased fragmentation, those sorts of impacts on the habitat of the Northwoods. Deer have always been described as an edge species, so they thrive on fragmentation. It's no secret by now that deer also thrive with exurban, suburban, and even urban development. In fact, some of the highest deer densities in North America have been recorded in the forest preserves of the suburban counties surrounding Chicago. 215 individuals per square mile. The long-term trends in terms of more variation on the landscape, more edginess, more fragmentation, and as Don was talking about, milder winters mean that we're going to have a lot of deer. And I think if we're going to also achieve some measure of conservation of other biological resources, I don't see any alternatives to hunting.
Isn't that the issue?
Yeah, I think implicit in your question too is the fact that a lot of, especially urban landowners that are buying property out here, that parcel size is going down. They're often posting their land. They're not hunters themselves. They don't want hunters on their property. Reductions perhaps in the amount of managed forest law or MFL land means that the hunters are being squeezed into public lands, and more of the landscape is actually becoming essentially a refuge free from hunting. And that's a significant issue. The DNR is very concerned about that, as well as the aging of the hunter population. The fact that we're not bringing along younger people, especially in urban areas, with any kind of tradition in hunting. Great questions. What a great crowd. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much to Don Waller and Tim Van Deelen for coming up here. They had to come all the way up from Madison and stay overnight. Just a reminder that our next Science on Tap, the Wisconsin Idea in the Northwoods, December 4th here at the Minocqua Brewing Company with Dr. Kate Vanden Bosch from the Dean of UW-Madison's College of Ag and Life Sciences. Thank you all so much for coming and for making this a great night, and thanks again to our speakers. Good night.